Hi all. Thank you to everyone for attending our sixth talk of the Neurodiversity and Disability Equality event. Today we have the Disability Inclusive Science Careers, or DISC for short, team from Heriot-Watt University, including Professor Kate Sang, who is a Professor of Gender and Employment Studies, Dr. James Richards, who is an Associate Professor in HRM and Law, and Abraham Babaji, who is a PhD student in management. They will be discussing the importance of implementing reasonable adjustments within higher education for disabled people and understanding disability inclusion from a managerial perspective. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to the DISC team.
Thank you very much, Lee. I shall just share my screen. We've got a few slides, not too many. So you should be able to see my slides now. Are you able to see them? Yep, I can see James saying yes. So thanks for the introduction, Lee. My name's Kate Sang, and I'm the Programme Director for Disability Inclusive Science Careers, which is an EPSRC funded project run by Heriot-Watt University, partnering with the University of Edinburgh, UCU Scotland, Trade Union for Academics and Professional Services Staff in Scotland, and the National Staff Networks. And I will ask James to introduce himself.
Hi, hello everybody. Yeah, I'm James. I'm the business school at Heriot-Watt, Associate Professor in HRM, and lots of research interest related to disability, neurodiversity, and also a range of things to do with employment relations and organising.
Abraham?
Hi everyone, I'm Abraham Babajide, and I'm a PhD student as well as a research assistant working on the DISC project at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. So we're going to be sharing the presentation between us, but I want to reassure you this is not 45, 50 minutes of being talked at. This is an interactive session. And what we wanted to do is to give you a taster of the disability training that we've been delivering to universities, so research leaders in universities, but also outside of universities. So we've delivered some training to trade unions, private sector organisations, the Scottish Government, and also charity organisations. And this training is co-developed with disabled researchers, particularly disabled researchers in the early career phase, so PhD to postdoc, postdoc to first lectureship, and it builds on a range of data, interviews with disabled academics, interviews with line managers, trade union reps, senior leaders in universities, and also an analysis of every single Scottish university's disability policies. And we've been rolling this training out, and the aim of the training when we're delivering it for senior leaders in universities is really to try and improve senior leaders' understanding of disability, the social model of disability, and also to demystify what reasonable adjustments might look like. So we're going to begin by, and probably you know a lot of this already, but we don't want to assume people's level of knowledge, setting out what we mean by disability, why we think the social model of disability is important, and reflecting on the Equality Act and the responsibilities that exist within that. And in the second half of our presentation, we move on to an activity, which is built around a scenario that comes from our data and thinking about how we might employ reasonable adjustments for that particular early career researcher. And I'm going to hand over to Abraham. So Abraham, do you want to go through the rules of engagement?
Yes, please. Yes. Can I have the slide for that, please?
Yeah, the slide seems to have disappeared, which is why I asked you to do it verbally.
Okay. I mean, I can just go through it here from here. And rules of engagement, we want, as I said earlier, we want this training to be more interactive, and engagement is very important. So for access, I think break, if anyone needs a break, at any point in time for any reason, please feel free to take a break, and but don't forget to mute your microphone to avoid distracting other people with background noise. Also, it's important to, if you can familiarize ourselves with the platform as well. So, for example, if you want to raise a hand, the tools at the bottom, we can use that to, there's a hand symbol at the bottom of the Zoom, so you can use that to raise your hand to share your opinion or have any, if you have anything to say. And also check your microphone as well, please, to make sure they're working properly so people can hear you and whenever you're speaking. About camera, we need everyone to put camera on so we can see each other and make it more interactive for everyone and more engaging as well. And lastly, if you have any questions, you can use the chat box at the bottom as well to share to share your questions, and we will respond to that as soon as possible. I'll hand over to you, Kate, to talk more about defining disability.
Okay, thank you, Abraham. So just for everyone's benefit, because I'm sharing my screen, I can't see the chat box anymore. So maybe Abraham or James can let me know if there's any questions or comments in the chat. So now I'm going to hand over to James, who's going to spend some time talking to you about what we mean by disability and what disability meant in the context of disability inclusive science careers.
Okay, thanks, Kate. I think there's a next slide, isn't there? Yeah, defining disability. So there are many ways of looking at disability, whether you call it defining or theorizing it, but we're going to take you through two of them, providing you with the highlights in a sense, and some of you may be familiar with these terms, these definitions already, and some of you won't be. So clearly, if you've heard of these terms before and very familiar with them, please be patient with me for the next 5 or so minutes. But I suspect there will be quite a few people who perhaps have not come across disability in the terms that we're going to take you through now. So could I have the next slide, please, Kate? So we're going to start, first of all, with what's called the medical model of disability. A lot of people, practitioners, academics have historically used the medical model of disability, but what you will find is that very few will actually refer to it as, quote unquote, the medical model, because this is how many people throughout history and society have come to understand disability. So with the aid of this figure, that kind of gives you an idea of how this approach can kind of lead to all manner of situations. It's likely to be an approach that sometimes gets used and it leads to not always the best outcomes, let's say. So as noted at the bottom, the medical model is the traditional and historical view, and it has many uses, but we believe it to be quite unhelpful in far too many situations, most notably in terms of positioning the individual as to blame for the situation. The disabled person is a problem, as you can see in the middle, or it places too much onus and emphasis on the individual to be responsible for their own kind of condition, let's say. And we talk about in employment context, it is an approach that in a kind of way kind of absolves the employer, the manager, potentially the HR function of any kind of meaningful responsibility. So as you can see, this is all about quote unquote impairment. I've done a lot of research, as I said before earlier, on neurodiversity. So I'll just use this example in relation to autism. So the medical model would, this is not what's on the slides, of course, this is just interpreting what's on the slides. The autistic person, according to the medical model, needs to be cured, needs to be trained in some way to take on the traits and characteristics of a quote unquote neurotypical person. An autistic person is associated with meltdowns, not good at joining up different pieces of information. You know, psychologists, psychiatrists call this kind of the theory of mind. Socially awkward, needs a carer or some kind of advocate or whatever, is disorganized, unreliable. So the model in itself, whilst it doesn't set out to do it, but you probably can imagine how stereotypes of disabled people can build up and be reinforced by this kind of approach. So Kate, could you move on to my final slide, which is the social model. So this is the social model of disability, an approach that we believe is the best approach in addressing disability in the workplace and wider context, of course. I mean, Kate's going to mention after this the Equality Act. The social model effectively fits in with notions related to the Equality Act. It is supported by HR professionals. You've got the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development have recently become advocates of the social model. The TUC, the Trades Union Congress, that represents employees, has been a long-term kind of advocate of the social model of disability. So this is not a fanciful kind of approach to disability. This is actually something that was created by disabled people, disabled activists in the 1970s. So, but we feel this has got real traction. A limitation, before I go any further, is ultimately that it doesn't remove the impairment, whatever that may actually be, but it gives us a lens, a tool that we can see where we're going wrong if people in your workplace who are disabled are getting a bad time, and this is a good way in which to kind of look at this. So if we kind of draw upon, if you like, an example again of autism, disability becomes ignorant, intolerant managers, potentially ill-informed colleagues, or bad-tempered kind of customers, if you like, or wherever, things like that. It could be protected jobs. It could be just generally treated differently and negatively. And in terms of autism, I think as a group that they have the highest unemployment rates in the United Kingdom of around about 80%, and even very recent research by the Office of National Statistics kind of confirms that, and very little has been kind of grounds have been made to improve that over many decades. So yeah, and also autistic people are seen as kind of weird and become isolated in the workplace. So it changes the focus, the emphasis, and the problem, as it says in the middle, ceases to be, let's just concentrate on what the deficit or the deviancy of the individual. Forget that. Let's just look at everything that's around that person, what is causing that person difficulties and problems. And that's the social model. And I'll pass that back to Kate now, who's going to take you through the Equality Act.
Okay, thank you very much, James. So before we move on, are there any questions or comments or reflections on what we've presented so far? So I think one of the key things for us is that we would argue in our research that it's not being autistic in the workplace that's disabling, it's being autistic in a neurotypical workplace that's disabling. So it's the workplace that disables people, not their, and I hate the word impairment, but it's the word that's used in the literature. So it's whether it's being autistic, whether it's having a long-term health condition. And that is why we would say disabled person, not person with disability, because for us, the person is disabled via the environment. They don't hold the disability themselves. So I think there's something in the chat, is there?
Yeah, do you want me to? It's a comment more than a question. Okay. And somebody's saying that the social model is a positive way in which to look at this and constructive identifying solutions. I don't think we could disagree anymore with the person who said that.
Yeah, so that's really helpful. And for us, it's really useful, and it's really useful if you're doing work, you as a trade unionist, for example, or you're a line manager, because you're focused then on how to make the environment more accessible, not about fixing the individual. I think there's another chat that's popped up. There's another box, Q&A.
Would you like me to read that?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, that would be great. Yeah.
So someone has said, in certain cases where a disabled person is struggling with their tasks/responsibilities, there is dispute between the employer and employee over whether reasonable adjustments go far enough or are possible. Rather than a disciplinary route for this, there is a capability route that basically has the same outcomes/ramifications for the individual. how might a disabled person challenge this?
So I think that's a really helpful and insightful question. You know, whether someone's going through disciplinary or capability ultimately leads to the same kind of outcome, and we'll get onto this a bit later about the experiences of disabled people working in universities, how that can be challenged. What our data suggests is one route to challenging it is to focus on this idea, and I say workplace adjustments, not reasonable adjustments, but the term reasonable is used because it has to be reasonable to the employer and to the disabled individual as well, not just reasonable to the employer. What we know is that very few people in universities know about Access to Work, which is a government-funded route to accessing workplace adjustments. We know there's very little creativity from line managers and HR in terms of what adjustments might look like. So for us, and I think James can probably add a bit more to this as well, because the other side of this is James and I are both quite experienced caseworkers for UCU representing disabled people. So we've seen this as well, is there's a need for an ongoing conversation. There's a need for line managers and universities to recognize that people's needs might change. And just because you've tried one adjustment doesn't mean that's the only adjustment that you try. And I was speaking to a law firm yesterday, and they said to me they have a kind of ongoing trial and error approach to reasonable adjustment. So they try one thing, if that doesn't work, they try something else, and they'll try everything they can until that is exhausted. And they basically said they very rarely need to go through the capability approach or disciplinary approach because they usually are able to find an adjustment. So how might a disabled person challenge that? One route is through trade unions. And you might know that disabled people are more likely to be covered by collective bargaining in Scotland than able-bodied workers. There's also the potential through schemes like Access to Work. And there are also specific organisations that can help particular groups of people represent themselves. So there are groups, especially for autistic people, for example, there are certain organisations like Scope that will focus on certain kinds of impairments. But I think I'll ask James if he's got any additional comments on that.
I don't think I've got anything particular very different from what you've added, Kate. I would, and how I would see it, whether I was a rep or whether I was just a supportive colleague, and I had a colleague who was going into a situation where, in any situation where they're facing capability, and especially the disabled, of course, you know, I'd be saying, before we start any further, go any further with this, what adjustments, as Kate said, have been put in place to help this person? You know, have they been in long? Are they adequate? Have they been in place long enough to measure their outcomes and achievements? Have they been revised? Should they be not as effective as they were probably hoped they were in the first place? So that might be my first line of inquiry, and I wouldn't be letting anybody take me down any further in that process unless that was established. What are the facts in terms of the support that person is actually receiving? And if that's not forthcoming, you know, I'd be looking to have that kind of meeting suspended with that information provided. And usually, in my experience anyway, probably Kate's, things start to happen, positive, of course. That's my thoughts anyway. Back to you, Kate.
And what I would say in a project that James did on a few years ago with a trade union, that quite often disability was disclosed through the capability or through the disciplinary process. So it was at that point that someone would disclose, or they would be supported by their trade union to get a diagnosis. So quite often it triggers the other way around, that at that point someone will then declare, and there is some interesting legal research on this, so that it quite often is declared at the capability or a tribunal stage. I can now see the chat, and I can see there's another comment in here. It might be something also around recognizing that everyone is different with different strengths and less developed areas. It might also be around avoiding assumptions of culture behavior, which may vary and are often not explicit. Clarity there can be very helpful. And I think, you know, that's true. And I think people can get quite, or employers can think reasonable adjustments can be really expensive or really onerous, and quite often they're not at all. So for example, it can be just someone working from, I don't know, 10 until 6 to avoid the peak hour traffic, for example. And I can see Lee's put some helpful comments in the chat about the Glasgow disability or diversity policies, and also a link to Access to Work. So I'm just going to move on to very briefly talking about the legislative framework that supports issues around disability. and that's the Equality Act 2010. So as you probably know, the Equality Act brought together all the various equality legislation, including the Disability Discrimination Act. So the Equality Act has both quite a tight and quite a loose definition of disability. And quite often people will ask, what is legally protected in terms of disability? And there's only three broad categories of conditions which are protected automatically under the Equality Act for disability. And those are any cancer diagnosis, multiple sclerosis, and HIV. And from that point, someone is protected for life under the Equality Act as disability. Disability is a protected characteristic, and it's defined as a physical or mental quote-unquote impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on your ability to do normal daily activities. So what that means is any condition can be covered under that. So endometriosis could be covered under that, diabetes could be, conditions around neurodiversity will be, mental health conditions, any condition that lasts for 12 months or more and affects your daily activities, and employment is considered a daily activity. So under that, a person is protected and an employer must look at putting reasonable adjustments in place. Now, what's really important is also under this, if someone declares to anyone at the institution they are disabled, as far as the law would be concerned, they have declared to the institution they are disabled. So if someone were to come to you as a line manager and say that they believe they are disabled, they have disclosed to the institution, and that puts a legal responsibility on the institution to provide reasonable adjustments. So this is quite useful, but you can also see that the focus is there, quite a medical model approach focus. The focus is on the impairment, but the focus on reasonable adjustments is much more of a focus on the barriers to that person's full inclusion and their ability to thrive at work. So are there any sort of questions or comments on the Equality Act? Not seeing anything new pop up. So what we thought it'd be useful to do is to give you some of the headline findings from the various sets of data that we have for DISC, and to talk about what the issues are that are faced by disabled researchers and what they've reported to us. So as I said, this brings together quite a variety of data, interviews with over 70 disabled academics, interviews with key stakeholders on the management side of universities and trade unions, also analysing disability policies across Scotland, but also the broader literature around disability. So as James said, certain groups experience far worse outcomes. So as James said, autistic people are the least employed of all disabled groups. But generally, when we look across the literature, we see that disabled people are more likely to be unemployed, but they're also more likely to be underemployed. So in other words, working below their skills, qualifications and experience level. So in our data, for example, we saw academics leaving higher education after postdoc, after PhD or after postdoc. That was seen as the critical career juncture for people to remove themselves from higher education. People reported discrimination, and sometimes this was explicit discrimination. So disbelief from line managers, a reluctance to implement reasonable adjustments. And other times it was more what we might call implicit bias, just a belief that there are no disabled people in academia. And I remember when I first started this research in 2017, I was told I wouldn't even find 15 to 20 disabled people across the whole of UK higher education to interview. We see very low reporting rates in universities. So most universities are around 1 to 2%. HESA data tells us around 4.5 to 5% of staff have declared disability, compared to somewhere in the region of 40% of the overall population. So we know that reporting rates are very low. It doesn't mean that there's not many disabled people in universities. It simply means that they're not declaring to their institution. And people don't declare because of fears that it will have effects on their career progression. And our data suggests that that's a valid concern. So we have line managers reporting very little self-confidence in terms of managing disability, line managers really just preferring for there not to be any disabled people. And we also see through university policies that disability is always positioned as a negative. So it's positioned around reducing sickness absence rather than in terms of supporting career progression or the kind of strengths that we might have from a more diverse workforce. As you probably know, there's a disability pay gap in higher education, and we also see marginalisation of disabled people in universities, not feeling like they're fully appreciated and not feeling like they're part of the culture, but also feeling marginalised and that they don't belong. People report very limited access to public and social events, quite often linked to transport problems. And again, commuting was a key aspect of causing issues for disabled people at work. And not just people with mobility impairments trying to access public transport, but also people, say, with mental health conditions, with anxiety around driving through peak times or traveling for conferences, but also chronic pain conditions or heavy menstrual bleeding, making commuting or traveling for work very difficult. And we also see an assumption that disabled people will be the subjects of research, not those engaging in knowledge production and dissemination. So there's an assumption that those delivering any kind of research or teaching will be able-bodied, even when they're researching and teaching disability. But we also know that a diverse science workforce, for example, leads to creative solutions. So having disability improves representation. It's good for students. So one of the most profound quotes I had from a participant was that he was dyslexic. He thought it was not possible to be dyslexic and an academic until his favourite professor told him that he was also dyslexic. And following on from that, he said he could suddenly see himself working in universities and was then pursuing a PhD to have an academic career. So before we move on to our exercise, are there any comments or thoughts or reflections on the experiences of disabled academics that we've shared here? Obviously, you can use the chat or you can raise your hand.
I've not seen any messages, Kate, or new questions.
Okay, so Abraham, I'm going to hand over to you, which is to take us through the activity, so the activity is based on an interview with a disabled academic who was an astrophysicist and her experiences of moving in or becoming disabled during her academic career. And then it'll be over to you to answer some questions as to how that person could be better supported. So Abraham, over to you.
Thank you, Kate. So what's going to happen in the next 10 to 15 minutes is I'm going to read the scenario to you. And the scenario is about an early academic who's living with an invisible disability. So, and after that, we can then go through the questions, but please, I would just like us to engage more, especially at this with this activity, because I would like to share one of the things that come up from us that with senior management is that there is hesitation when it comes to people engaging or interacting with disability. So in these activities like this, can we just take an opportunity to try as much as engage and to get much out of the training as well. And this is Mary. Mary is an early academic who 3 years of visits to the GP has led to a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis is an immune system condition that affects the brain and the nerves. So, and already Mary is, although Mary is glad to have a diagnosis and treatment, but she tells you that she has started to experience anxiety, particularly in relation to traveling to work. Mary tells you that traveling during the peak time, for example, rush hours, also makes her symptoms much worse and significantly exacerbates anxiety. And Mary shares that the anxiety started in 2018 when her symptoms began. and tells you that this applies to using public transport, and as she needs to get 2 buses to work, which often gets stuck in the bad traffic and are late. So she misses her connections. To manage this anxiety, Mary started driving to work, but found that sitting in the car in heavy traffic only worsens the anxiety and can also be problematic when she's expressing relapse of neurological symptoms such as tingling in her hands. So when Mary gets to work, accessible parking space is often occupied by an able-bodied colleagues or non-disabled colleagues' cars. Mary is considering leaving her education to work in private sector where she thinks work can be more flexible and have flexibility of traveling at different times. So I would like to note that this training is a research-led training, as you know, as Kate mentioned as well earlier. And these are like real example of the lived experience of disabled people or disabled academics in higher education. So we'll go through the questions, and I'll read the question, and then you can feel free to come in and and offer any kind of a workplace adjustment that comes to your mind that you would like to implement in such situation if you have someone like Mary that you're line managing. So the first question is, does Mary's conditions of multiple sclerosis have protection under the Equality Act 2010? As Kate just talk about the Equality Act and why. So please feel free to join in and share your thoughts, please.
So I think that there's a comment in the chat, Abraham.
Yes, she has a formal diagnosis. Yes, Janice said that. Thank you very much. Yes, because under the Equality Act, there are 3 disabilities that automatically qualifies you, and multiple sclerosis is one of them, and HIV as well, and I think there's another one. Others are not listed. There's no list for any other disability under the Equality Act, but Mary automatically qualifies. And not only that, our condition lasts longer as well, beyond 12 months, according to the Equality Act. You have to have a person is disabled with a substantial condition lasting longer than 12 months. So our condition lasts longer than 12 months. And also another comment here, MS is directly covered by the Act from diagnosis. Yes, because of the symptoms as well, living with some multiple sclerosis involve the experience of fatigue and pain, and your daily activities are affected as well, and that includes walking, commuting to work.
Could I add something else in there?
Yes, please.
Abraham, is that okay? So yes, you're correct, she is, because multiple sclerosis is protected under the Equality Act directly. But even without that diagnosis, Mary would be protected under the Equality Act. So I think it's important to say that one does not need a diagnosis to be protected under the Equality Act. Any condition that lasts for 12 months or more, and you can see that Mary started experiencing symptoms in 2018, which is 3 years ago. So her anxiety is also protected under the Equality Act for disability.
Any other comments, please? Right, I'll move to the next question then, and to discuss more about that. What could be put in place to support Mary's work-related travel? Any ideas, please? Oh, very fantastic. Change hours. Office. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Gordon. And for accessible parking. And but what even the situation whereby the parking is occupied by able-bodied colleagues as well? What can you do into that situation, which could be frustrating for disabled academics? And to support Mary, she could start and finish work later and work from home. Fantastic. Or combination, working as hybrid. That's a good inclusive mechanism as well for workplace adjustment for somebody like Mary. Active management of disabled parking space. Fantastic. Yeah, great, great. Should be more accessible parking and better management. Yeah. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, good. Well, I would like to get on to like what actually can be done, you know, to address that kind of issue, you know, issue of parking. What actually can be done to address that kind of issue of parking? Like, if you can give an example, that would be great. Yeah, good. Some penalties, yeah, would be great. Sanctions, yeah. Name and shame. Great. Don't want to be abusive. Yeah. Email circulated around to everyone that disabled parking is only to be used for this. Thank you very much. That's fantastic. Communication is very essential. Yes. Any other ideas? What about traveling? Any other ideas about traveling? Working from home and hybrid? Taxi? Great. Review the necessity of travel. Yeah. Make sure that the management of the accessible space is brought up indirectly to avoid potential discrimination against disabled people in the first blue badge. Okay. Yeah. Great. Great. Thank you for that. Our work will be pay off for taxi. Thank you for that. That's a good idea as well. Working hours as well could be great as well. Working hours, especially if you're working in academia, you know, you can allow, for many people living with living with a condition like fatigue related, they might have different, productive hours. Well, you know, what regards to as pacing sometimes, and pacing means balancing activities and energy. So as multiple cirrhosis is a condition that involve fatigue as a symptom, which is huge. So that's another workplace adjustment that could be useful as well, like allowing flexible working hours to accommodate pacing. I'll move on to the last question, and then we can discuss about that as well. Are there any other workplace adjustment that will help Mary? This is quite similar to the previous question. Not making it compulsory to work from office, only when required. Thank you. Yeah. She could have longer breaks on a day, right? She's not feeling great energy level wise. Yeah, great, yeah. Working pattern. Review office setup for any other improvements to ease the daily routine. That's a good point, Gordon. Thank you for that. And that just reminds me of, for example, many people don't know about the condition of fatigue, or how these symptoms of fatigue, actually, the lived experience, how it does affect the daily activities of disabled academics. And working from home as well, in terms of setting up the office is very important. That's a good point. Many people that live with condition of fatigue, sometimes, for example, chronic fatigue syndrome, might feel the need to lie flat sometimes, So things like ergonomics chair could be very useful as well in terms of setting up an office at home. Thank you for that. Having access to work assessment, great. Kate mentioned that earlier, and ensure any training or equipment that could improve the experience with the office at home as well in place. Great, thank you. Thank you for that. Supportive line management and from colleagues for space to lie down, taking time out. Great, thank you. I have periodic reviews to check adjustments and helping and change if necessary, particularly given the condition comes and goes. Great, that's true. That I think that's a key point there that you mentioned there, the fluctuation aspect of it as well, because the condition, you know, fluctuates sometimes. Having supportive colleagues will really help. I think that's the main thing. That tap into the, you know, the main reason of this training, the social model of disability, which put a lot of responsibility and accountability on, you know, the environment, people, non-disabled people, or colleagues to be more supportive. Yeah. All right, thank you very much for engaging. That's fantastic. Proactively promotes and supportive culture, fantastic. Yeah, good HR and okay, OH support. Great, thank you. Right, we'd like to move on now to the next activities, and I'll hand over to you, Kate. Thank you everyone for engaging.
Thank you very much, Abraham. They were all really good suggestions. The issue of parking is quite a difficult one, because if we rely on a blue badge, they're incredibly difficult to get hold of, and many people just won't be able to get hold of them. And actually Mary's situation was that she got an accessible parking space that was 2 kilometers away from her office, and she has mobility impairment, so that was no use for her. So eventually 6 months later was able to get a parking space outside her building, but she would drive to work, find somebody who'd already taken it, and then she'd have to drive home again. So yeah, it didn't work out particularly satisfactory for her. So I'm going to pass over to James now, who's going to take us through what we can commit to, having learned more about the social model of disability and thinking about Mary's.
Okay, thanks, Kate. Could you just move on to the next slide? It's probably easier just to get things started. You can read this off in your own time. So this is just one last thing that we're going to do with you before Kate finishes things off in a few moments' time. I understand, you know, with anonymity rules to do with this particular workshop, it might be best that people just perhaps use the chat function, and I will try my best not to name people. So two straightforward questions. Well, straightforward questions, we believe. You know, based on what we've taken you through, what that might have conjured up in your own mind and from your own experiences, you know, what would you take away from this? Hopefully something positive as well, of course. And one thing that you are committed to perhaps doing a little bit differently, you know, facing these situations, whether you are a person who is not disabled and you work with disabled people in whichever way, or maybe even if you are disabled, you know, what have you potentially learned about how you could get more support or draw attention to people on certain things. So could everybody contribute their own thoughts to the chat function, and we can perhaps comment on and read a few off? Okay, you only need to be a couple of words for each one, really. Yeah, value refresh regarding disability and responsibilities we have as individuals and institutionally. Yeah, think of all these things at different levels as well. That's helpful. oh, Lee's saying as well that you can unmute yourself. I beg your pardon for confusing myself with the rules. Don't know whether people want to raise their hands. Yep. Be more aware. Hopefully our session has helped you be more aware. I think it's helpful to go back to the two models of disability as well whenever you're facing a situation, and look how that kind of potentially might help you resolve the situation or move things on in a more positive way. Review current practices, see how we can become more inclusive. Also important to know the people you are working with. Yes, somebody's also saying that they may well inform the university of disabilities, even if I don't need the support right now. We encourage our students enough to disclose somebody's asking, I don't know, Kate, you may be the best person to answer this question, but I'm curious what the situation is with conditions which repeatedly impair for 2 to 4 months with okay function in between, but are expecting to keep recurring. I mean, I see similarities with the multiple sclerosis example here, because not all conditions, you know, are affect day-to-day exactly the same. Kate, do you want to?
Yeah, I just put into the chat that fluctuating conditions are also protected under the Equality Act. And as I said, you don't need a diagnosis to be protected under the Equality Act. So yeah, that would be covered.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of raising awareness as well. I mean, because we believe in the social model, it takes away from an emphasis on knowing about medical conditions. It's really about understanding the environment and the structures and the power and the influence that's more important. And I think it's important to trust people. If people say that it doesn't, you know, I think you know, managers, colleagues just have to probably be a little bit more kind of taking people's word for it. Yep, somebody's saying, forgive me if I've missed any out, importance of clear and concise information for busy line managers. Yep, signposting for them. It's something that's routinely come up in our research, not just in DISC, but more generally in our research, that line managers are perhaps the best people to support disabled people in the workplace. Can also be, you know, it can be the opposite in a sense as well. They can disable people quite a lot. Line managers are very busy, so yeah, it's important that they get good support, prompt support, clear support. You know, you don't want to make a line manager's role more difficult than it actually is. And obviously, wider support should it be more a complex case. Somebody's saying they like the social model. The problem is the disabling world. Yep, that's the main feature of it. This means that each one of us can make a change. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's a paradigm on life I would like to think of it being, you know, let's look at around us rather than look at what we see as being the problem. You know, let's see whether the problem is more complex and based on more broader things. I think we're kind of running down our time now. I'm not sure what time it is now, but
so we've got a couple of minutes.
Okay, well, it's just, I think it's a response to your about not having to necessarily to have a diagnosis. Somebody's put in the comment here, you don't need a public declaration to be covered by legislation, but in capital letters, emphasising the point, of course, it's still dependent on employers being willing to discuss adjustments. Yeah, but all the better to be informed. And you know, one of the difficulties of dealing with such issues, especially if you're affected by them directly, is that you can be quickly ground down by process and frustrated, having gone through processes similar in the past that have not worked out very well. It's one of the reasons why a broader advocacy that we're making is that it's important for unions to have reps trained up to support people, because they can be important sources of information, emotional support as well to a point. But being there in a situation with a manager or a HR colleague, and and going through these things and being clear and insistent, because it's difficult enough trying to get adjustments without, especially there's some kind of pushback or confusion. Let's see, there's one more comment. Somebody's saying, makes me think the more adjustments are a standard, a natural part of being at school, the more everyone will grow up expecting to see them. Yeah, I mean, that is something, if anything, that touches on the nature of the Equality Act that Kate mentioned before. Clearly, we couldn't go into depth about that, but that's one of the important things about the Equality Act, in the sense that in any other context but the workplace, organisations are expected to anticipate disabled people and therefore should be more reactive. So as a university, as an educational setting, that's why universities are probably far better set up to support students, because the law actually says that. Same with schools and colleges. In the workplace context, employers are only legally obliged to respond and react to when somebody discloses or a problem or an issue is brought to their attention. So yeah, I mean, following the social model is a cultural change, and and I think everybody would benefit from it as well. This is not just about, I mean, it is to benefit disabled people, of course, but everybody would benefit in an environment where broad practices are standard. People are tolerant, people think of what they may be doing rather than what the fault is of the individual. These are important kind of cultures, if you like, to have in organisations and not just workplaces. Are we up for time now, Kate? Sorry. I
think we've got time for our one last slide. So thank you for that. There's lots of comments in the chat as well, so you've got a bit of a chance to read through them. So just very quickly, and this actually follows on to a question that's come in the Q&A, which you might be able to see as well. So the three things we'd like you to remember as you leave our session is the social model of disability, that we focus on making work more accessible to individuals. So we're removing barriers to inclusion rather than changing disabled people to fit ableist working environments. Share what you've learned today with colleagues and friends through your wider teams, thinking of ways to embed the idea of removing barriers to both the things you do on a day-to-day basis and more strategically. So thinking about procurement all the way through to the strategy for your teams. And also, don't be afraid to ask. There's nothing wrong with asking somebody what they need in order to be able to participate more fully. And sometimes people might not know because they're new to this themselves. They maybe have a new impairment, or they've tried the standard things to work and they're not working. So don't be afraid to have an ongoing discussion, open discussion with individuals. And that's the end of our slides. And it's now, we've got 2 minutes left if there's any questions. I'll stop sharing and that might make it easier for me to see the chat. There we go. So yeah, so someone asked about how can we ensure that colleagues have an understanding of disability? And I'd answered that in the chat about training wider teams, right through DISC, destigmatizing health conditions and disability, but also moving towards accessible workplaces that reduce the need for individualized adjustments. I think a lot of people see reasonable adjustments as expenses for a small number of people when it should be seen as an investment in improving the experiences for all staff. It is all about reframing and understanding of disability and adjustments generally. So things, we all have things that we need. It's just some of them are taken for granted. So if someone said to academics, you can no longer wear glasses at work or contact lenses, an awful lot of academics would not be able to engage in work. But we take glass wearing as a standard, or wearing contact lenses as standard. We don't think of them as adjustments, but actually they are forms of adjustments. So it's moving towards eradicating ableism rather than focusing on individualized adjustments on a kind of case-by-case basis. So that's us at 2 o'clock. This has been a fantastic session. Thank you very much, everybody. Unless there's any final questions or comments, I don't know if there's another for the Q&A. No, I think that's been answered. Lee, anything else you wanted to say?
No, just thank you all so much for the talk. Thank you. It's been, yeah, really thought-provoking, and yeah, it's good to just reinforce the social model of disability as well. So thank you all for today.
So thank you very much, and I hope everybody has a good weekend and manages to avoid the gale force winds that are on their way to the east coast of Scotland. Thank you very much, everybody.